Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today entitled Local Content and In-Country Value in the GCC and Beyond. For today's webinar, we'll be using the terms local content and ICV, or in-country value, interchangeably. That's because in most of the countries where we operate, one term is selected over the other. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined this webinar using your laptop or computer, but if you would like to listen to it via the telephone, the instructions are in the panel on the side. You will have the opportunity to submit any questions throughout this webinar by doing so through the webinar and the portal on the side. We will then take those questions at the end in a Q&A session and answer those for you. Today's webinar has been designed to give you Efficio's insight and overview to local content throughout the GCC and our experience from how it has been delivered and operated both here locally in country and by companies who are operating in the GCC but localized elsewhere. Functionally, this presentation is aimed both at senior leadership and the C-suite who are responsible for setting the tone for local content across their businesses, and for those senior managers and operators throughout the business whose responsibility is to embed local content into the day-to-day operations for their business. But firstly, I'd like to introduce myself and Paul. My name is David Mooney. I'm the VP responsible for Efficio's operations across the GCC. And from my experience over the last 25 years in both procurement and supply chain, I hope to give you some insight into how our major clients are developing their local content strategies in the GCC.
My name is Paul Yates. I'm Senior Manager at Efficio, and I manage our portfolio of local content activity across the Middle East.
So this first slide is really just to give you an introduction to where our experience comes from. We've been working in the GCC region since 2015, specifically on local content programs. Many of you will recognize Efficio's brand in a procurement context, and this is actually somewhere we have a high level of excellence. However, we've been working with major clients across the region, specifically on local content projects, because of its close link to procurement and to supply chain. We initially started this work by baselining the KSA economy in terms of local content on behalf of the KSA government. And this has now led to a large number of programs, both in the KSA and the GCC, for the clients that you can see sort of listed on the screen today.
So for today, we're going to focus our messages on 6 key themes, which collectively represent the operating model we believe all organizations need to focus on to maximize the return on investment in local content. The first theme is leadership. What role do the most senior management in your organization play in making local content successful? Measurement. How do we measure and track local content, and what are the best practices? Focus. Where do you focus your local content efforts and investment to achieve the maximum return? Prioritization. How do you identify the areas of spend which offer the greatest potential for local content growth? Operations. How do you change your business processes and embed local content to deliver on local content opportunities? And finally, we will talk about the ecosystem. How do you manage the diverse set of local content stakeholders that your organization needs to deal with? We plan to run through each of these 6 areas and describe the lessons we have learned in tackling each one.
So firstly, leadership. Leadership is our first but most important critical success factor. Without senior leadership and engagement, any LC program will struggle to achieve their goals and aspirations. The reason for this is that successful LC programs require top-to-bottom buy-in and support. Regardless of where the LC team actually sit, they will always need the full engagement of the leaders and managers from across the business to implement and operationalize their local content policies, processes, and procedures. In KSA, we have seen this in operation. The LC programme is being driven by the very top levels of government, and all the leading organisations such as Aramco, SABIC, Ma'aden, STC have adopted LC as a board responsibility and now have programmes and KPIs in place to measure this. Failure to get support from the top will make it doubly difficult for any LC programme manager to be successful. This means aligning your LC strategies and embedding them in your company policies and procedures. At this point, I'm going to hand to Paul to take you through how we would do this.
So in terms of setting the direction and strategy for local content, we believe there are three key elements that you need to get right. The first one is alignment. Local content cannot sit as an independent programme with no linkage to everything else that goes on in the organisation. The local content programme needs to be aligned with the overall corporate strategy. You must be able to explain how local content contributes to the organisation's strategic goals. If I took an example, if you were an organisation looking to expand your business in the region, you can think of local content as an opportunity to develop a competitive differentiator to win business in the future. The second area we would encourage you to look at are your strategic objectives. You need to be able to define what you are trying to achieve from your local content programme. This is rarely as simple as just looking at a single measure for localisation. Different organisations will have different areas of focus. For example, we've worked with clients that are focused on regional content, developing small and medium-sized enterprises, or female or youth employment. And those need to be embedded in your strategic objectives for your local content programme. The final area of three, you need a business case for your programme. You need to be able to explain the business benefits that you're trying to deliver. Good local content has to make good business sense. Examples of where local content can deliver business benefits include shortening lead times, de-risking supply chains, eliminating logistics costs, or reducing inventories. You need to be able to explain to your business how local content will benefit your business.
So measurement. First of all, we have to recognise that local content is not a short-term fix or a fad. Successful local content programmes take a long-term view and set goals and KPIs with a roadmap of how to get there. Like any journey, you have to know where you're starting, and therefore you have to identify where your baseline is and where your starting position is. It's also important to constantly track this progress against your roadmap and plan. For this reason, measurement is key. All successful LC programs will measure and baseline the as-is, and by doing so, they know where they're starting from and can identify where to put their efforts so that they can make successful improvements over time. By putting measurements in place, you can do a number of things. You can measure the level of improvement over time. You can identify where the real opportunities exist to improve local content in your business. And also, and more importantly probably, you can adapt the programme if the results are not being achieved or come as expected. In Efficio, we've built a number of tools and systems to help clients measure and track the success of these programs. And Paul now will describe how we do this with our main clients.
So it's important to say that there is no international standard definition for local content, and the different governments and organisations we work with around the world will use different measures and take a slightly different angle on local content. However, there is a degree of commonality around the concept of local content, and we found, particularly working in the GCC, the focus tends to be on four elements in all of the countries that we work on, and those are pictured on the right-hand side of this slide. So the four areas where we can work on contribute to local content is goods and services, or your supply chain or your procurement spend, in terms of employment, in terms of capital investment, and in terms of capability. Now, the advantage of having a level of standardization in measurement is that that standard measure incentivizes all players in the supply chain in the same way. So we're all facing in the same direction, trying to achieve the same things. It drives a common language and understanding, and it can also reduce the administrative burden of running local content programs if everyone has the same understanding of what we mean by local content. When we've worked with our clients, we've adopted a standard methodology which we then tailor to the individual situation, but it basically revolves around a four-step process. The first of those steps is to define your measures. These measures need to create the right incentives throughout the organisation, and they need to be linked back to the strategic objectives we just talked about. So what is it we want to drive in the organisation through measurement? So when we talked about strategic objectives, I gave the example of building relationships with local small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, if that is a priority in your organisation, a strategic objective, that should be part of your suite of measurements. So you need to be able to build that suite of measurements that tackle each of your strategic objectives. Once you have the measures, the next step, as David mentioned, is to baseline your organisation. You need a clear and accurate view on your position today. We encourage organisations not to focus on whether the initial baseline is good or bad, but rather think of it as the starting point for the journey and the point from which you can measure progress. The third step is then to set targets for the future. The targets need to be challenging, but they need to be realistic. And they need to be based on the potential for localization across all areas of your spend. So the baselining and target setting are substantial data-driven efforts to put your measurement framework in place. We typically set targets using multiple data points, benchmarks, and our experience from across different sectors and different geographies. Once you have those targets, they then need to be broken down and cascaded throughout the organisation. What you're trying to achieve there is to make the delivery of local content a shared responsibility across the management team. So everyone is responsible for delivering on the local content business case you've developed. Once you've got the targets in place, you then need to monitor and report. So you'll need to establish the frequency and mechanism to continuously incentivise behaviours across the organisation. And David mentioned some of the tools and techniques that we use. And our experience has demonstrated the value of things like online reporting tools that allow key stakeholders access to monitor their own results in local content against their individual targets in real time online.
The next key area that we want to discuss today is focus. Quite often our clients will ask us, where do I focus my efforts in my local content program? In the past, localization has been primarily focused at the nationalization of jobs or employment directly. These programs have had some success in localizing that employment. However, they have not had a big enough impact on localizing industry or generating the level of entrepreneurship that is required for business to grow and to generate further employment in any economy. Today's LC programs have shifted this focus from nationalization of jobs to a focus of their supply chain. And the very best of LC programs are focused both on the upstream and downstream supply chains, i.e., they are working both with their customers and their suppliers to identify opportunities to localize production, manufacturing, and the delivery of services. This means it's key to build local content into your business as usual supply chain and procurement life cycles. Companies can have a major impact on their overall local content success factors and KPIs by focusing their attention on how they deliver business as usual in the supply chain, how they embed procurement practices with good local content practices. By working with your suppliers or your customers, companies can really achieve results and can generate real success in their local content goals. They know how to drive, these will drive business growth locally, but they will also create an environment for foreign and direct investment, which will be attractive to those international suppliers that work with local businesses. In the next slide, Paul is going to help describe how we help you focus on these key areas.
Thank you. So, as David has described, our experience shows that the supply chain offers the greatest potential to boost local content. Whilst it's difficult to generalise, our experience and analysis suggests that in most organisations, the potential for boosting local content through improvements in procurement spend and supply chain is larger than the sum of all the other potential routes for employment. And that's why it is typically the area of focus for us and for the organisations we work with. So if supply chain is so important, what are the implications for integrating local content? The three areas we wanted to highlight today which we think you should consider. The first one is, what are the implications for your organisation structure? And we found the most effective companies align their local content organisation closely with procurement, whilst providing some point of escalation to address the natural tension between the two. So you typically have a procurement organisation that is focused on cost and cost reduction, and you have a local content that is focused on boosting local content. And sometimes that can generate a conflict. Now, the two need to be closely aligned, but they also need a route for escalating and resolving those conflicts. So we typically see the procurement organisation sharing the same reporting line as the local content department, whether that's into a broader supply chain management function, into finance, or into shared services. Second point we think you should consider is capability. So outside of your senior management team, the most critical population for the success of local content are your procurement staff. They are where the key business processes, which will change local content levels, are executed. They're effectively at the coal face of local content. So they need to be aware, they need to be trained, and they need to be managed to deliver on the local content agenda. The third area, and we'll come on to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but is around policy and business processes. And effectively what successful organisations need to do is to revisit their procurement and supply chain policy and processes to address local content. Our belief and our experience suggests that changes are most successfully implemented through existing business processes, and we advocate a minimal, light touch approach to the level of change which can deliver success. So if I can give you an example, we would typically advocate maintaining existing governance structures around tendering decisions once local content has been included. There is no need to introduce new sign-offs for local content and new process steps, but the existing decision makers in that governance process need to add it into their current list of considerations when making award decisions.
So next, if you have already agreed that the focus for your local content program should be within procurement and your supply chain, the next question that we often receive is, where should I prioritize my efforts? If you recognize that you cannot grow local supply chains overnight, if you agree that local content cannot be delivered at any cost, then it's important that you prioritize where you put your efforts and to ensure that you get the best success or chances of success within your local content program. In order to prioritize, you must understand where those opportunities exist. And to do that, you need some detailed analysis and you need some detailed plans to do so. Good analysis will show you where the opportunity lies and help you focus. Good planning will help you approach those focus areas with a timeline that will help you be successful in implementing your local content strategies. Focus means having a targeted approach. Focus on areas where results can be achieved. Focus on areas where the barriers to success can be limited or reduced. Therefore, in the next section, Paul is going to take us through how we do this prioritization and achieve this focus.
So the first step in identifying the priority areas in your spend is to identify the potential for local content growth. Effectively, what you're trying to do is look across your spend and work out what is the upper limit to what's achievable in terms of local content growth. Now, the baseline that we already discussed when we talked about measurement should provide you with the data to assess where you are today in each category of spend. And that's why it's important when you're setting up the measurement system that it is data driven and you do the detailed analysis, because that gives you your starting point in each category. To assess the potential for local content growth, we would typically triangulate multiple data points. They would include benchmarks, international examples, and our experience on similar programs to identify a maximum potential ceiling for local content growth in each category. So that across the board will then give you the full potential. We would also work with expert resources within the organisation. They bring a level of insight and knowledge of how goods and services are used in the organisation, which we can then use to temper those potential levels to local conditions. So once we then have that view on potential in each category, we need to go on to assess how difficult is that going to be to implement. How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? What are the barriers to implementing those levels of potential local content? Again, this is driven through experience and knowledge from similar programs, but again, it's also very important to involve stakeholders and experts within your own organisation who will have very clear and strong views on, for example, the potential to switch sources of supply from international and foreign suppliers to local sources of supply. They will have a strong view on some of the natural resistance within an organisation that you will encounter as part of your local content programme. Once we've got a view then on both the potential for local content growth, the upper ceiling, and the degree of difficulty, we can use that to prioritise and build a programme for implementation. Our experience is that the most successful programmes take a balanced approach, combining short-term quick win opportunities. So, for example, the opportunity to switch from a foreign source of supply to a local distributor, with the longer term and more challenging initiatives, which typically deliver the greatest impact on local content. So the obvious examples are where you can actually set up new sources of manufacturing supply within country. But those are typically require the greatest investment, the longest lead time, and the most effort. And therefore mixing those with quick win opportunities ensures we can demonstrate progress and success quickly while still delivering on the challenging targets in the longer term.
So once you understand where you believe the opportunities lie in your supply chain, you then need to develop the programs to actually realize them. Different opportunities call for different approaches, but in general, our clients tend to characterize these programs by where they are focused within their supply chains. And these two areas are supplier development and market development. These two terms can often be confused, so let me give you a little bit of a description of what we mean by both. For supplier development, this means that the programs are actually focused on working with your existing supply chain and its extended supply chain. That means putting the time and effort into working with suppliers to develop new strategies, new sources of supply, and to look at how your suppliers can actually localize their manufacturing and provision of services. This is really about working with your existing supply base to improve the levels of local content over time. It's this area that most companies and clients will approach first, as it's the one that can actually give them the quickest level of return. The second area is market development. The difference between market development and supplier development is about establishing new suppliers within your existing supply chain. That means trying to attract foreign suppliers to localize within the kingdom. It looks at building new opportunities for new entrants into your marketplace in terms of what they can provide, manufacture, and supply. This is all about identifying those new sources of supply, either locally or through that foreign direct investment, so that they can move the overseas supply to a more local supply. Typically, we see companies adopting both approaches and running parallel work streams to do this. And Paul is now going to describe for us some of the different elements of both sort of structures.
Thanks, David. So the focus for supplier development typically involves reviewing existing procurement or tendering processes to create incentives for your existing supply base to deliver higher levels of local content. So the point of contract award provides the maximum leverage for a buying organisation, and it also provides the maximum incentives for bidders to improve their local content performance. So often a lot of the focus is around that point of award and the tendering process. So as such, we would often encourage companies to start by reviewing their existing process to ensure they are getting the most out of them and creating the right incentives. There are numerous touch points in that process, but some of the critical questions you need to ask are, how do I maximise the inclusion of local bidders on my bidding lists? How do I embed local content in my request for proposal? How do I evaluate and assess the local content responses to those tenders? What commitments do we require from the successful bidders, and how are they captured in contract documents, terms and conditions? And then what are the implications for a successful bidder if they then go on to fail to meet their local content commitments? Now, this is a very large topic, and as David described, we often see our clients starting their local content programs in this area. So we've addressed these questions with many organisations. There is no way we can fully do it justice on today's call. This topic could effectively be a call in its own right. Once you move beyond the tender process in supply development, you also then need to think about the supplier management process. So what process do you currently have in place to manage incumbent suppliers, and how do you integrate local content into those processes? So that was supply development. I think the focus for market development is usually very different, because it typically involves the setup of a new capability and process to actively manage the opportunities to develop new sources of supply in country. So whilst supply development tends to focus on existing processes, market development does tend to be a new capability in its own right. The challenge for market development is to effectively manage a funnel of opportunities. There are usually many opportunities identified either internally or through approaches from potential investors, but these typically only lead to a very small number of actual investments at the end of the process. So our advice here would be to establish a robust stage gate process to take these opportunities through. Implement effective program management for the full pipeline. You'll need clear business ownership for each opportunity to ensure it has the focus and the experience required. And you'll also need to put in place strong governance to ensure that opportunities can advance promptly through stage gates based on a robust business case, or can drop out and be eliminated once they're identified as non-viable.
So as we've heard, local content, or ICV, is important, but it's only getting more important. It's very important if you're a company that's already based in one of our GCC countries, as the level of oversight, governance and reporting is going to increase. Your commitment and your social license to operate will be built upon the success of your local content achievements. For companies that want to do business from overseas with these companies based in the region, it's doubly important. Even as an existing supplier today, your future tenders and bids and awards will be judged upon your future commitment to your local content programs. This really raises the bar for local content and the importance for suppliers and for companies all over the world. It's not just about those companies that are based within the GCC region. As a result, governments are putting more and more focus on local content, but they're also putting more and more opportunities to support companies in place. There are many, many different organizations throughout the GCC that are helping companies identify their local content opportunities and deliver that. But we have to accept this is still an embryonic area of business, and therefore it can be very confusing as to where to go for help. Therefore, it's very important that you understand the ecosystem that you work within. You need to understand the landscape and where you can leverage your existing network or those organizations out there that can help you improve your local content scores and KPIs. However, it doesn't make that environment any more easy to navigate unless you understand who are the different operators within that. Roles and responsibilities for the players are not always clear, and grey areas do exist. Also, different stakeholders within this ecosystem have different agendas and different priorities, and therefore it can be very difficult to understand who to go to or who to approach. As a program imperative and one of our key success factors, we make it very clear to our clients that it's very important for them to understand who's involved in their particular industry or in their particular life cycle. You need to map this as an ecosystem. You need to understand where you fit in that ecosystem, and you need to understand how you can leverage this to your best success. To do this, Paul is going to help us understand how to leverage and understand that ecosystem.
Thanks, David. So the picture you can see here on the slide is a generic overview of the ecosystem in Saudi Arabia. This is not meant as a shortcut to the answer, but it is meant to provide some indication of the complexity and the number of potential stakeholders that David was referring to, and how difficult actually this task can be. It's about the number of stakeholders, the diverse roles of those stakeholders, and these pictures, this ecosystem is going to be specific to your organization. So we recommend as the first step is to build this picture. So, list the stakeholders for your organization. You need to understand who they are, what their role is, what's your relationship with them, both today and where you're aiming to get to, and what are their priorities and agenda within the local content ecosystem. Once you've mapped the ecosystem, you can start to plan for how you manage it. This takes the form of a communication and engagement plan. So anyone who's been involved in a major change program within an organization will be familiar with communication and engagement planning. I think the added context in local content and local content in GCC is simply the number of stakeholders and the number of those stakeholders that are external to the organization that you need to address and think about. Now, because of that, we strongly urge organizations to proactively address communication and engagement. On your local content program, you're going to have scarce time and scarce resources, and that means you're going to need to prioritize your engagement activities. You must identify the stakeholders which are critical to the success of your program and actively engage with them. Whilst some other stakeholders, you may be able to be more passive and reduce the level of interaction. And this all comes back to your business case and your strategic objectives for the program that we talked about up front. So, for example, agreeing how financing support could be provided to your market development activities may need you to prioritize early and regular engagement with a financing agency. So when you pull opportunities through your pipeline of market development, you can line up financing support for those organizations quickly and in a standardized manner. Or another example would be if your particular focus is on development of particular skills or capability within the country, that might mean that you need to prioritize your relationship with a university or a training institute. A final point I will make here is I would urge you to schedule time to review and update your stakeholder map and engagement plan on a regular basis. The environment does change regularly. Government structures change, companies merge and divest, and the regulatory environment continues to evolve. But also the priorities in your own organisation will change over time, and therefore where you need to seek advice, support and help from external stakeholders may change. So I would encourage you to make sure somebody in your local content team has responsibility to build, maintain and manage the engagement plan.
So in summary, before we move to the questions and answers section, there are some key takeaways from what we've heard today. Firstly, leadership is critical. We need it to drive the local content programs, and it must come from the very top of the organization if we're to be successful. Secondly, measurement is a minimum requirement. Over time, it will be a government requirement to show progress and to report your actual achievements. Therefore, getting your measurements in early, setting your baselines early, allows you to identify where you can prioritize and where you can focus. The third key takeaway for us today is that of all the levers that are open to you in terms of local content development, your supply chain offers you the best opportunity to achieve success. Both upstream and downstream supply chains, i.e. your customers and your suppliers, have an impact on your local content success. Today, most governments focus on measuring and recording your supply chain, your inbound supply chain. However, these are always circular in nature, and there may be a second opportunity to work with your suppliers and your customers in joint programs to develop your local content programs. Next, analysis. We need to understand where those opportunities exist, and to do that, you must analyze your supply chains, you must understand your spend, and you must identify where those opportunities exist. By taking a follow the money approach, you can understand where the money that you spend with suppliers ends up in the environment or the ecosystem. Is it going to local companies? Is it going to local manufacturer? Or is it going across borders and overseas? This analysis is key to identifying future opportunities and must be carried out on a regular basis. Second before last is the program that you approach. Our clients are taking a dual approach to both supplier and market development. By doing so, they're not locking themselves into long-term agreements that may become inefficient over time. They're not developing relationships with suppliers that can't be adapted or changed over time. By developing the market as well as their existing suppliers, they also open up opportunities for innovation and for new ways of doing business. This actually might even be a competitive advantage in the future. So therefore, supplier and market development dual approaches are core to a sustainable and a long-term local content growth. Finally, you need to understand the landscape of the country that you're working in. You need to understand both the regulation and the rules pertaining to local content, but you should also understand where the support and where the opportunities to get help with your local content program can come from. It's important that you do this, and it's important that you leverage your existing network to help you with this. So in summary, we have a number of key takeaways that are important to any LC program. Any program that we would recommend with our clients would incorporate all of these elements. And we would be happy to work with you and with any potential local content managers or board directors with that responsibility to help them understand how they could form and put in place their local content strategies. Now, it's at this point I'd like to open up for some questions and answers.
Okay, I picked a question up when we were talking about measurement, and specifically somebody came in with, I have some major areas of spend in my organisation that I know I'm not going to be able to localise. Why should I include those in my local content calculations? Now, this is a question we have come across in a number of different guises and a number of different organisations. And we do always recognise that there will be areas of your spend that are either very difficult or perhaps impossible to localise. Examples might include proprietary technology, or maybe just very simply the lack of a particular raw material availability within the country. Now, our advice there is that you still need to consider your whole spend when you are measuring and reporting local content. And that's particularly true where you're using national standards and national approaches for local content measurement. Because if you veer away from that, then suddenly your measurement is no longer comparable, tendency to vary over time, and you will start to get into some fairly arbitrary discussions about what you do and you don't include. But where you do cover the fact that some areas of your spend may be unaddressable from a local content perspective is when you set targets. So for us, local content is very, very rarely a 100% gain. You're not aiming to localize all of your spend. And so what you do when you set the targets, and we talked a bit about the kind of detailed analysis you need to do category by category, is establish those targets at a category level. And obviously for those categories of spend which you can't localize or are more challenging, those targets are zero growth or very low growth or very long-term growth. And then that also then provides you with the opportunity when you report results over time to provide the commentary around which areas of your spend you are prioritizing and are not prioritizing and for what reason. And I just make one final point actually here as well that we have seen, which is areas that are difficult or impossible to tackle today may not remain the case forever. So production techniques change, technologies change, there are substitutions, there is movement in the marketplace, which may eventually see the opportunity for localization in the longer term. And again, that would argue for inclusion of all of your spend in your local content measurement.
We have an additional question here. The question is, if I do not have the right level of support from my board for a local content program, how do I change that position? This is actually something that's quite common with a lot of our clients. And what we found here is that, first of all, we've got to understand why that support is not forthcoming. There may be a number of different reasons, but understanding these reasons will help you address them. Reasons that we have seen for this can be that people just don't understand the importance of local content or the impact it may have on their day-to-day business operations in the future. They may not understand that it may become a regulatory requirement in the future. They may see local content as a nice to have, something that should sit with their CSR objectives. If this is the case, then I think the best approach to emphasizing the value of local content is to put it into commercial terms for an organization. If your senior management, if your board understand that by not focusing on local content, that by not delivering these programs can have a direct effect on sales, on winning tenders with some major companies, on your regulatory licenses to work within certain countries. Once they realize that this has a real commercial impact on it, they should then identify that local content is an area where they can help remove that risk. Companies should see local content both as a risk and as an opportunity. For me, as an ex-CPO, local content for me was always an opportunity area. For me, as somebody who was responsible for eliminating or reducing supply chain risk, by localizing supply, I could remove some of the risks and barriers to moving goods, services, and people across borders and across thousands and thousands of miles. But secondly, by localizing supply, and increasing the numbers of local suppliers, I could actually increase competition. And over time, I hopefully can drive down the cost of my supply chain by removing unneeded logistics costs and by just generating a good competitive environment locally. So I think in summary to that question, I'd be pointing to the local content team that if they feel they don't have the sponsorship or engagement or buy-in at the most senior levels, they maybe need to switch the tone of their message to one about how this is of commercial advantage, but that it also carries a risk for not managing this area.
You picked up a question. How do I go about embedding local content into my procurement procedures? So here we would typically take a top-down approach, and we'd usually start at the procurement strategy and procurement policy document level, and review that and make sure that adequately reflects your strategic objectives for local content. Then we would move through the process and procedure documents to review and update those, and then move right down actually into work instructions, the tools and templates that the procurement staff use on a day-to-day basis to run and award contracts, for example. So I think I talked briefly while we were going through the presentation that we would advocate an approach that looks to adapt and update existing business processes. We don't see this as an exercise in creating a lot of new paperwork, process documentation. It's about reviewing what already exists and then working out how and where to embed local content in that existing framework such that it can be most effective. And there are touch points throughout the procurement process. So right from the moment where you put your sourcing strategy together, and how do I construct my sourcing strategy in such a way that it provides the best opportunities for local bidders to participate and have a reasonable chance of winning the work, all the way through the process, right through to once you've awarded the contract and how do you manage the suppliers. But having said that, it is throughout, but there are a relatively small number of touch points, and those can be updated quite quickly and quite straightforwardly. And the other advantage doing it on that basis is when you subsequently come to implement the changes and roll them out with your procurement department and your procurement staff, the training and engagement that you need to do is based on existing processes that people understand and operate today. It's based on existing documentation that they're familiar with. So actually what you're training on, what you're engaging on, your change management is focused solely around the elements of local content that you have enhanced those processes with.
We have an additional question here. The question is the supply chain the only area of the organization I should focus my efforts on? And if not, how do I engage the support of other areas of the organization? Well, in my experience, the answer to this is you definitely should engage much more widely across your organization. Local content will not be successful if it's the sole responsibility of a local content or a procurement team on its own. The responsibility for local content must be shared, and shared at a senior level and across all businesses. This is because, even like procurement in itself, you cannot deliver it on its own. It requires the buy-in and the support of project managers, of business managers, of people who are responsible for managing the delivery of your supply chain and your business. So the second half of that question is, how do I get that support? Well, in my experience, the best way to do this is to actually embed the success of local content into your business measures, and to do this for all senior managers. The most successful programs that we have seen have taken local content KPIs and built them into the personal business commitments of the senior managers across the organization. By putting these local content commitments into the personal commitments of plant managers, of project managers, of senior managers across the business, you will draw attention to the importance of it from an organization's point of view. You will get support, you will get focus, because these managers now have a key component of their personal targets linked to local content. It's also important to make sure that these senior people across your organization, these people who have responsibility for delivering your operations, truly understand the value and importance of local content. And to do this, communication is key. If people think local content is somebody else's responsibility, if people think local content is going to be delivered by somebody else, then they will not focus their attentions on it and they will give it little support. One of the examples that we use for how to change this is to think back over time. If we look back 10, 20 years ago, things like quality or health and safety weren't as critical as they are today in businesses. But if you look at major organizations around the world where quality has been improved and safety has become a #1 goal across their businesses, they've done this by making it everybody's responsibility. We believe that this is something that we should do with local content as well. Local content should not be something that sits on the sidelines of your business. It should be something that becomes business as usual. It should become another core KPI that you look to regularly, monthly, quarterly, and measured alongside safety, quality, production targets, etc. So I think if you really want the senior support and engagement and buy-in from across your organization, you have to expand the responsibility to do so across those senior managers and senior leaders.
We've had another question in on the subject of measurement. So with apologies, we're jumping around across the topics that we covered today, but hopefully we can try and address the questions. And this one was specifically around kind of national standards for measurement, and asks, why should I adopt the national standard if it's not aligned to my objectives and what I'm trying to achieve with local content? And I have a certain amount of sympathy for where that question is coming from. However, if you do have a national standard, we do believe that you should consider that as part of your suite of measurement. I think I mentioned that there are certain advantages to having national standards around local content definitions and measurement. It allows for comparability. It means everybody understands local content in the same way. Everybody uses the same language, understands how they can influence, and incentivizes users in the same way. There's also quite a practical element to it as well. So as a result of our work, we meet a lot of supply organizations that we're working with to try and boost local content in the supply chain of our clients. Now, it's much more straightforward if we can talk about local content in the same way that they talk to local content with some of their other customers. Otherwise, you have to go through a rebriefing. It's a slightly different emphasis. It's a different measurement. So we would always encourage organizations to look at the national standards for measuring local content, including in the suite of measures. However, it's not a question of or. I think it's a question of and. I think you need to develop the suite of local content measurement that is right for your organization and right for your strategic objectives and will help you to deliver your business case. I mentioned some examples in the presentation we gave. Another good one actually is that some organizations we work with where they have operational sites in remote and challenging regions. And actually for them and for their senior leadership, a lot of their focus is on what am I contributing to that region and to that local community. And often that can even become a license to operate question if you don't get the local community on side. So it may be that in addition to measuring the national standard, you also start to then measure what am I contributing to the region? What am I contributing to the local community? We've had other clients whose a very strategic focus on innovation, for example. And again, what's the local content contribution to innovation and innovation within the country? So just to summarise the answer, I think you should be looking at the national standard, but that does not limit you having a suite of measures that also include objectives that are specific to your organisation.
Okay. So I think we have time just for one last question here that's just come in, which is, where do you see the priorities for managing external stakeholders, and who should I focus my efforts on? I think this is a difficult question to answer, because it really depends on where you are in your local content program or efforts. If you're a new organization, if you're new to local content, or if you're new to a particular country that you're operating in, then it's important that you reach out to the stakeholders who are going to influence the setup and design of your local content reporting, the local content regulations. As Paul said, in some industries and some of the countries where we operate, local content is now a license to operate issue. If you're particularly in the oil and gas industries, this is now a minimum set of requirements. However, there are other industries where, for example, in technology or telecommunications, where the importance of local content has not yet been set as a regulatory requirement. However, we do see in the next year, 2 years, that becoming a minimum. So it's important to identify, first of all, who are the stakeholders that you might engage and what you need them for. Where are you in your own program, and what's important? Where are the gaps in your local content delivery efforts? For some companies, they may need additional support in finance, in access to support from governments or from financing bodies to actually help them set up a program or to train and develop their people in these particular areas. For other companies, they actually may need support in identifying new areas of supply, identifying key manufacturers in those countries where they either have existing operations or want to enter into new. There are different types of bodies who will do this. The local trade bodies, the local chambers of commerce can all help, but they are still developing their local content processes and understanding. But they would be one of the first types of stakeholders that would be of value and worth engaging in. So there's unfortunately not one simple answer about who I should prioritize as a stakeholder or where I should start, put all of my efforts. But it's important, I think, first of all, map your existing local content program and understand where you need support, where you need help, and where do you see the challenges coming forward. So I think we're now at a point where we've run out of time. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you for your attention. This is a key area of importance across all of the GCC regions, and it's a key area of interest with all of our clients. We'd be happy to meet and to discuss this with you at any point or time in the future, and we will probably have future webinars on this topic. This particular webinar will be sent with the presentation over the next 2 days, and you should receive this in your emails and through the invitations that you have accepted. So finally, thank you from myself and from Paul for attending today's webinar. We look forward to hearing from you in the future.